So Andrew Byrne, Australian composer, resident in New York, coordinating the Carnegie Hall Festival program. What motivates you to compose?
What motivates me to compose? I've always composed, always from the beginning. And I think it comes from responding to other music. So it's not about external things, it's about when I was a 10-year-old kid, I'd be learning the children's bark, and then the natural thing for me to do was to write music in response to that.
Yeah.
So I think and it just kind of builds from there. You develop a whole process, and one piece builds from another, and you just keep doing it, getting out of bed every morning and doing it.
Do you find that because you grew up in Melbourne, that your music has any sort of particular connection with Melbourne, or indeed what I like to call the Third Brunswick School?
The Third Brunswick School. No. I mean, when I was a student at La Trobe University and composing in my 20s, before I went to the US, the idea of being bound to a locale, writing music, Melbourne music, Australian music, it sounded very provincial to me. Then going over to the US, it's not a kind of original thing to say, but you start to realise how Australian you are by being outside of Australia. Yeah. So more and more my music has kind of drawn on Australian themes, sometimes landscapes.
I notice a marked change in your style from the early pieces, from the early 90s, through to now, where it seems to me that your music is much more imbued with the sort of post-New York minimalist style, if you don't mind me saying that.
No.
And I must say that looking at just the piano pieces, let alone any ensemble pieces that you're writing, they do tend to fry the brain, though. You like to pose now more sort of philosophical problems for the performer, something that's you're challenging the performer even though the music might sound relatively simple on the surface?
Well, I don't try and fry the brain of the performer, but I guess what has always concerned me or interested me in music is polyrhythms. The idea of just having one rhythmic level which is of relative interest, but superimposing another one which is going at a different speed, and at maybe 3 or 4, and that makes it quite difficult to perform, especially if it's a solo piano piece, because you've only got 2 hands.
Yeah.
So I don't kind of start off with the idea of creating a great challenge for the performer, but creating a polyrhythmic piece which by its very nature is very difficult for one performer to perform.
I notice that a lot of the rhythms are prime number based, and is that a conscious decision on your part, or is it just the way that things develop?
No, it's not a conscious decision on my part. I think in every piece there's a different approach to rhythm, and there are always some things that carry on to every piece, but each piece is a different kind of rhythmic idea. Sometimes it's a Fibonacci series, sometimes it's just a simple 2-3-4 ratio, or get more complicated than that.
Yeah. And how do you find people react to your music when it's performed? Mainly, is there a difference in audience response in New York and, say, Australia?
That's a tricky question. I had a piece performed for piano and percussion earlier this year in Brooklyn, and it was very positive response to that piece. It was for the piano and the percussion were both amplified, so you get this kind of wall of sound coming at you. So one thing I noticed, a different responses between performance and recordings, and also just the physicality of trying to play this complicated music. Although on a recording you mightn't be able to perceive that, seeing a performer do that live I think is a very arresting thing, and people really respond to that. I haven't heard my piece played in Australia for a long time, so I really can't answer that question. 10 years.
10 years since you've had it performed.
Yeah.
We have been performing them.
Oh, without a doubt, I haven't been here much. That's the problem. Yeah.
I must say that the audience response I've noticed in Australia is very positive. You tend to draw a lot on, let's say, the folk music, which is basically pop or rock music. Is that a conscious thing?
Yeah, it is. One of the reasons why I wanted to go to New York was what they call post-minimalist music, and drawing on classical music or contemporary music and combining it with pop music and folk music to try and create so it's not pigeonholed, but rather it kind of draws on many, many different traditions. Yeah. So it means that it's approachable, when someone hears it for the first time.
So if you don't mind me saying so, the folk element, if you like, you draw a lot on pop and rock music, it seems, in not only the way that you like your music amplified, but also the way that it sort of grows out of a very simple idea a lot of the time. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a conscious decision on my part to try and draw on all the different aspects of music that I love. Growing up in Australia, of course, we studied piano and classical music, but also rock and roll is really important as well. So when I went to New York, that whole post-minimalist tradition, that's trying to incorporate many different types of music, world music, pop music and classical music, and it seems like the natural thing to do. I mean, as Steve Reich has once said, he finds it weird that a lot of contemporary music writes music for dance, and people sit and it's very abstract and there's no sense of rhythm. Then everyone after the concert goes out to the nightclub to dance, and everyone's dancing and feels the rhythm, and why can't we combine those two to create some kind of interesting music?
Is it, I mean, you've studied with, as you say, at La Trobe. Now, that was, the music department there was founded by Keith Humble, a great, avant-garde composer, studied with René Leibovitz, and people of that era, what I call the Third Brunswick School, like John McCaughey, etc., are all very educated in the post-World War II Schoenbergian influence. So why this feeling of abandoning that for something, say, as obvious as dance music, as obvious rhythmically as dance music?
Well, I guess it took all composers need to find their own voice, what interests them, and what gets them out of bed in the morning to write music, and that's the kind of music that interested me. That you take a simple dance music motif or something like that, and by layering different polyrhythms, you create some very complex idea. It's something that I always was interested in. So while studying, the European avant-garde from post-World War II and the Schoenberg school was interesting, that was not the way I wanted to go, And so going to America was a way to really find my own voice. I mean, Keith Humble as well, he I think had many different strands to his kind of musical output, and he also was very involved with Dada type of events and the post-Cajun world as well. But at La Trobe, it was a pretty much European kind of sensibility.
I would have thought that the turning back towards simple forms and simple rhythmic music such as dance music, though, would be against, and then making it complicated would be against the ethos of minimalism, surely.
Well, one thing that interests me about post-minimalist music is that they took as their kind of model minimalist composers like Steve Reich and Philip Glass, music that was simple, very repetitive, and it's very sweet sounding. It's very got that 70s vibe to it. The next generation said, I love how we put music together. It's really interesting, but let's make it gritty and urban like the city of New York, and let's incorporate other elements so that while it uses the same ideas of minimalist music, it sounds much more confronting and abrasive, and that's something that I think is very, very attractive.
So this is again, though, the same process. It seems like a squeeze box process in music, where we have the struggle between the romantic notions of feelings, emotions, sweetness, etc., with the notions of no, we don't. We want that. We want to incorporate mathematics, science, etc., in the musical material. Isn't that just the same process then happening over again?
Yeah, maybe it is. I mean, we talk about the difference between Stravinsky and Schoenberg with those two aspects of musical expression. And I've always, just in terms of taste, much been attracted to Stravinsky's ideas, the objective music, than to, say, expressive music. It's just the kind of Mahler is someone not to my taste, even though I've heard his symphonies many times. It's just not what I like to listen to.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, Stravinsky was really paying homage to the Russian, sort of artificially generated Russian tradition of pagan rites, etc. All of that, of course, was made up, mainly by Diaghilev. And so that's a sort of a harking back to more primitive types of music, if you like, more ethnic-based music, to relate to that sort of thing. And as a third stream at the beginning of the 20th century, that seems to be very similar in a way to the ideas of minimalism.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, not the language, but certainly the rhythmic, the motorrhythmic isorhythm and so
Yeah,
forth.
I mean, and you take something like Lenos, which does draw, I mean, includes some Russian folk music,
Yep.
and his approach to rhythm, absolutely the case. And another stream of music in the 20th century that leads to, say, minimalism is the American mavericks, people like Charles Ives and Cage. And Cage, although of course
Maybe
Cage's
Partch,
music,
yeah.
Harry Partch, doesn't sound anything like Steve
Cal,
Reich's.
yeah.
Cal, it's thinking of what is silence, what is rhythm.
Yeah.
I think that is really, he revolutionised that whole way of thinking about rhythms and form and expression, which kind of gave a space for people like Steve Reich and Philip Glass and the postmodernists to emerge.
What do you think? I mean, somebody who takes an idea like that to the extreme, of course, is Morton Feldman, but it's like it works once, but you don't really want to hear it again.
Is that your feeling with Morton Feldman's music?
That's my feeling of Feldman's music, yeah.
It's great demands on the listener, let alone the performer. I mean, Triadic Memories is what, a 60-minute piece, 80-minute piece?
Some of them go on for 5 hours.
Yeah, well, the string quartet goes for 6 hours.
6 hours,
It's one of those things you get into the zone. It's like the music of Lamont Young. I heard a piece of his premiered for cello and 6 recorded cellos and went for 6.5 hours.
Can we sustain that though, as as everything's fighting for attention these days, and you're doing concerts at Carnegie Hall, you'd have a very good perspective on. I would have thought that unless you grab people in the first couple of seconds, you've had it.
In the case of Lamont Young, the first hour, you've got to grab them the first hour, you've lost it. I think that one thing about New York is that there are many, many different types of music, many different audiences. So somewhere like Carnegie Hall, which is pretty traditional, I mean, they have to cater for their subscription base. They would never put on an event like that.
But you've put on very unusual festivals, etc. Are they not held in Carnegie Hall?
They are. But I think in the Berlin Festival, we had experimental Berlin music in a context of a much larger festival with the Berlin Philharmonic and world music, so we can get away with it because that was there. But of course, all those pieces are about 20 minutes long, so it's not a 6-hour concert. I mean, I think someone like Lamont Young, he's saying this, this is what I believe, this is my voice, take it or leave it. And if you don't like it, then that's fine. You can listen to other music. But I appreciate that he puts himself out there and says, this is my vision.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very inspiring thing. Even if you don't want to, hear all his music, I think it's a great fact that the society can provide the context for someone to live who can do that type of thing. Yes. And it will sustain people in the future, because it's such an original vision.
Yeah. Do you think that way of looking at music on that sort of a timescale is more related to the fact that we now have this extraordinary, almost 100 years of recorded music, and there is an audience there for music which satisfies a sort of a meditative state of mind?
That's an interesting point. I think definitely that has created an audience for his music. I mean, I think that he would say that he wants people to be very active and to be an active listener, so that you shouldn't be kind of going to sleep. And it's not new age in that sense. But I think his music is associated with the 60s and California and the hippie kind of world. And so I guess that whole idea of kind of zoning out is creating an audience for his music.
Yeah.
But I mean, for my music, I've never written a 6-hour piece, and I don't intend to, because I think that's not something that interests me to pursue.
No, but I do find it interesting where your essential music comes from, what you are trying to tease out. Obviously, it's more complex than just wanting to extend a very simple idea into allowing something to flower. I mean, that's really the hallmark of every composer.
Right.
But I'm just interested as to all of these influences, where it might be leading you, where you see your particular direction, if you see a direction where you're just doing it. I mean, there's for me it's very difficult to see any sort of direction in music these days. And while that leads to a great egalitarian amongst different types of music, it is nice to be able to say, well, there is a definite, horizon there, which we can sort of aim at. Otherwise, then it gets down to interpretation, and interpretation is the only sort of way forward, really.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think that. I don't think about that much, to be honest. And it's so difficult. There are so many composers doing so many different things in the world, just in New York and the rest of the world, that what sustains me is what interests me, you know, the kind of music I want to write. And it does seem to find an audience, people seem to relate to it, and I think that's what I'm about, you know.
Yeah.
So I don't think it...
And if you didn't have an audience, would it might bother you?
Yeah.
It would?
Yeah, it might bother, I mean, for sure. That could be
because
an
you're
issue.
relatively comfortable without relying on the composing, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the composing, I like the idea that I don't rely on composing to make a living, you know. So I can do what I want. I can choose to do the pieces that I want to do, and I don't have to accept all the commissions that come my way when it's something that really is not of great interest to me. I think that's a great situation to be in, because you can end up spending a lot of time,
especially in New York,
doing a lot of work you don't want to do.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, in terms of where I was coming from, I mean, you talked about this a little bit before. When I was in Australia, I was trying to find my voice, trying many other things, and then going to New York was a matter of, in my music, paring it back to the absolute minimum. So there are going to be no melodies, there'll be a static harmony which will be unchanging for 10 minutes, and so we are just going to focus on rhythmic, kind of changing rhythmic ideas, and which is what I did, and then gradually reintroduce other elements to the music as you develop your own style. So I hope that, you know, you can play my music or hear my music and say, oh, that's the music by Andrew Byrne. For me, that was the process of developing my own style, to pare it right back and then start afresh.
Your music seems to me to grow out of your relationship with the piano.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true.
Is it true?
Yeah. Well, the piano as an instrument is a perfect vehicle for, I think, the musical ideas that I'm trying to explore. I've just got a huge register. In terms of timbre, it's relatively uniform. I've got performers like you know, who can do anything. So I can write very, very complicated music, and people will really give it a go and have great performances. And I think that, and also the kind of the relatively cool nature of the piano. I mean, I know it's a very romantic instrument.
Do you think it's cool?
Well,
I agree with Elton John. I think it's impossible to look cool at a piano.
Well, I
think he said sexy, but you know. It's the same
well,
thing.
you look sexy at the piano. Don't get me wrong. You're a pretty cool guy, but
can we cut that? Good.
But the idea of, you know, not very expressive, but rather cool, detached music,
yes,
I think
cool
works very well
sense,
with the piano.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And I think I've written a lot of piano music because I have a lot of encouragement from pianists.
Yeah.
And it's as simple as that.
Yeah. It's, so, I want to get back to your early development, and who you would have thought were people seminal to your development. Which composers in Australia, for instance, or who you studied with, who would be people you think influenced you the most? Or not influenced, but their ideas helped?
It's interesting, you know, a lot of composers talk about studying with great composers and using them as a model and developing from there. For me, it's really been about finding a very fertile environment, people who are full of ideas that can encourage you to kind of go in certain ways. So for me, it was going to La Trobe University.
That was the environment.
That was the environment there. I mean, it was although there was a certain kind of style that they were pushing, someone like John McCackey, who was my teacher and supervised my master's thesis, was very open and full of ideas and very stimulating. So he would say, you know, try lots of different things. And likewise, when I went to New York, I was studying at Columbia University, and a guy called Fred Lerdahl was my professor there, who is probably better known as a theorist. So again, he's not one of these very, very famous composers, but he was a person who would be able to kind of pinpoint what was of interest in your music, or be able to articulate what he felt I was trying to do, and say, follow that to the extreme. This is what you've got to do. And he would say, like John as well, I actually can't relate to what you're doing, but I believe that this is the right way to go, which is a really important thing.
Yeah.
In terms of Australian composers,
were there any such as I don't know, Graham Hare, who was around La Trobe, Keith Humble?
Keith Humble had retired by the time that I came through, so I didn't work with him. Graham Hare also was a figure who was overseas.
Yeah.
One thing that interested me about Graham Hare's music was his how he drew on Elliott Carter's polyrhythmic techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So even back then I was very interested in that kind of world.
Yep.
And trying to marry that with the Stravinsky or a more modal kind of sound world.
Yep.
I thought that was very interesting. Another composer who I think worked with Graham here was Carl Vine.
Yes.
A number of his pieces are very interesting rhythmically. It was a model for me. So I think those two composers were interesting. And for me, though, when I went to New York, it was a matter of making it more extreme. So they were a model in Australia, but going to New York allowed me to be more extreme in terms of pursuing those ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, that their music it sounds perhaps a bit more traditional in some ways, or it fits better into kind of certain concert program situations.
Yes.
The music I wrote in New York would be something that would be performed in a downtown loft, and it would be amplified, and you couldn't have that followed by, say, a Brahms quartet. So in that sense, it was different.
So you've embraced this idea of the downtown Manhattan sort of style, if you like, or milieu. What's in the future for you? What are you looking at? Are you branching out into other forms? Do you see just continuing along the same line? You work with a very small group of people in an ensemble, the Byrne Band. Tell us about that.
Well, it's hard to say where I will be, but what I plan to do is to, as I said before, I've stripped my music back to reintroduce folk tunes and pop tunes, and to use quotation more in my music. I think that's something of great interest to me.
Why?
Well, because what I did is, in the sense of removing all that stuff from my music, back to the bare bones, I got rid of melody, got rid of expression. Well, I mean, there's always expression, but you know what I mean? It was not obvious. And harmony, and now I have to find the kind of skeleton to hang my rhythmic processes, and the idea perhaps of using found objects, something we've used in sampling, but also to use in kind of live performance, I think is a really interesting idea. So it's inert materials that can be transformed in odd and strange ways, I think something that will interest me in the future. We'll be working with musicians both in Australia and New York to organise a kind of ensemble like the Byrne Band, which will kind of perform our music, and we will tour and record as well. I mean, I think that's a very fruitful way for composers to work. Rather than have a piece and you give it to a string quartet, another piece for an orchestra, and you kind of bounce around that way, to work with a dedicated number of musicians to really develop an original and very kind of finely honed style, I think is something very attractive to me.
One final question. Shortly, in the next decade, the next wave of technological advances will occur in robotics. Where is the place for the live performer, the composer, the musician in this fast approaching new world?
And, I think there'll always be a place for the composer and performer. In New York at the moment, in 2008, the recording industry is really in trouble. They're trying to find a model to try and make, with the internet and downloading and stuff like that. The one area of the culture field which is booming is performance. I think people will always want to see performers, and that connection that an audience makes with a performer.
Truly, even though we have like robots conducting the Boston Symphony, I think it was.
That's right.
Leonard
exactly.
Slatkin's gig. Yeah.
I'd be interested to see what that's like. But I think that the idea of interpretation will never go away. I mean, that communication and connection is something that robots will never be able to do. So we'll see where robots lead us.
We think.
We'll see where they lead us. I mean, I'm sure they'll be a tool and aid us in many different ways, but they'll never replace us.